In this video, you're going to see me take some incredibly beautiful wood and spend over 400 hours turning it into the most expensive and what I think might be one of the best sounding guitars that I've ever made. Stick around and I'll show you the full build and share some tips and tools that I use while making this guitar. I'll also explain a little bit of the story behind the wood and why we're calling this guitar the Phoenix. At the end, you'll get to see the finished product and you'll get to hear this thing. And trust me, you're really going to want to stick around to hear it. So let's get started.
Hey folks, it's Matt here. I have the honor and privilege of getting to kick this build off. So for the back and sides of this instrument, we decided to go with this absolutely stunning piece of Cerakote. It's an incredibly visually striking tone wood and great sounding too, but if you've never worked with Cerakote before, I'm always startled by how brittle and fragile it is. Chris likes to compare it to woodworking with saltine crackers, and I'm inclined to agree. Once the back has been book matched and very carefully comes out of our plate joining jig, again this wood is pretty fragile, it's onto the soundboard. The wood for the soundboard is Western Red Cedar from British Columbia, Canada, and this wood is where our name for the guitar, the Phoenix, actually came from. There's a little bit of backstory to this piece of cedar, but I will let Chris explain more about that later. For now, I'm going to book match and join these top pieces with our plate joining jig, and then it's on to the next step in the process.
After a couple of passes on the drum sander to remove a little bit of glue squeeze that we have, we can then head over to the CNC machine and have it cut out our sound hole, install the channel for our rosette, and then it'll cut the actual perimeter of the guitar out so that we have something that's beginning for the first time to look like an actual guitar. Now, Matt mentioned a few minutes ago that this cedar has an interesting story attached to it, and I'd like to tell you that story now. Our good buddy Aaron Lucas, who is the owner of Dark Forest Cypress, actually gave us this wood about a year ago. And the story of this lumber is that it actually started out its life in British Columbia, Canada. And in 1939, there was a wildfire that wiped out an entire hillside, and that hillside included the tree that this wood actually originates from. The burned out remains of that tree actually sat on that hillside for another 63 years until the year 2002 when somebody harvested it for its lumber. It then sat and air dried for another 22 years, and in the year 2024, it was given to me by my friend Aaron Lucas, and that's the wood that you see sitting in front of you now. Aaron makes it his life's goal to curate wood with an interesting story, so if you'd like to learn more, we are going to have a link to his products down below, and go check them out.
So like I said before, this wood is incredibly brittle. I'm taking a precautionary step here and using some Stumac No. 10 super glue in the more fragile spots to try and help stabilize this piece. This is one of those times where the cost in super glue and the time it takes to do this extra step will definitely pay off in the long run when we go to bend these sides. They're eventually going to be laminated anyway, so this is just going to hopefully save us some head and heartache in the next step. Speaking of the next step, we're going to go ahead and bend these sides into something that more closely resembles a guitar now. Chris is going to step in here to help because I've never actually bent Cerakote before, and it definitely has its own unique character while it's being bent. All woods kind of behave differently depending on their oil content and the composition of their fibers, so I was definitely glad to have his expertise here because the last thing I want to do is accidentally break these brittle sides while I'm bending them. Now we just rinse and repeat that for the other side and for the other two laminate pieces, and then yeah, we're on to the next part,
which is laminating the sides. And I know for folks that actually play guitar and know about guitar building, you hear laminate sides and you think, wow, isn't that something that we only see on cheap guitars? But I think that means that I'm just not doing a good enough job of explaining what it is that I'm doing here that is different than what you commonly hear as laminate sides. Laminate sides in the industry typically means plywood, which is just thin veneers of wood that are glued together to make something that's thicker and stronger, but none of those plies are really good high quality solid woods. What we're doing here is we're actually using two full thickness sets of sides and then laminating them together under a vacuum, and what we end up with is all of the benefits of the original tone wood with its full thickness and its full beauty, but also we make those sides much stiffer, which is going to help increase the acoustic properties of this guitar in a very large way. And that's because by having a very stiff rim of the guitar, it allows the soundboard and the back of the guitar to vibrate more freely and with more of their energy not being wasted in vibrating the sides. Because in my opinion, the sides of the guitar never really did much in the way of contributing to the overall sound of the guitar in the first place. And I'm here to tell you that once I started doing this, I was shocked by the difference that it made in the overall sustain that every guitar had. So it's one of those things that I did one time, and I will never build a guitar without doing it in the future, because it's a little bit of work on the front end, but my God, does it make a difference in the final product. And now that we've got those sides pretty much all buttoned up, we can move our attention back over to the soundboard where we're going to begin bracing it up. And this is my favorite part of every guitar build because it's where I'm actually going to give the instrument its voice. I only get one shot at this, and I won't know if the decisions that I made right now are going to be the right choices until I get strings on the guitar, which for me won't be for another few months. Which kind of makes this entire step like a science project every single time. I have to look at my notes from previous builds and try to take that information and take out of it what I think is going to be useful for this build, because remember, these woods are not going to react like the woods from the last build because they're from a different tree and they have different levels of density and elasticity, and a lot of the times they're just different species altogether. So I just think it's really cool that there's no doing it correctly. There's just trying to do it the best that you can to get the outcome that you're trying to achieve. And there's a beauty in that. And what you see me doing here is actually gluing on all of the braces in one foul swoop in our fancy tool called a go-bar deck, which is just basically a really primitive tool that allows me to get clamping pressure on all of the braces even way in the middle of the soundboard. Plus it just looks really cool. At this point, past me was trying to show you guys what this soundboard looked like and what it sounded like when I had it at this point, which was the point before I started shaving these braces to make this guitar top open up. So I held it up and I tapped on it to show you guys how stiff it sounded. Unfortunately, I don't have any of that audio, but I can tell you that it was very, very quick decaying and it sounded like a 2x4, so you'll just have to use your imagination. What you see me doing here is initially shaving down some of these braces to a place that's kind of in the ballpark of where I think that they need to be. The reason I do this is because I can't just go immediately to voicing this top without getting some information first. So by shaving them now, getting them to a place where they're in that ballpark, I can remove it from the clamp and then get a sense of how much more material still needs to be removed before I get to that magical place that I'm trying to get to, where the top is strong enough to hold the string tension, but also loose enough to be as musical as it possibly can be. Okay, we have the initial voicing done on this top. It looks real nice. I've stopped at this point so that I can get a sense of how it feels. Still feels a little stiff to me. I don't use any sort of, a lot of guys will do deflection testing and they'll use friggin' sonic responses with oscilloscopes and all this stuff. I do it old school. I do it using a feel. That along with checking my notes and seeing what I've done on other guitars, but I don't just copy and paste what the other notes said either. I use it as a way to get me in the ballpark. And this is getting close, but it's not quite there yet. But what I want to do now is give you guys a sense of how much more this top has begun to open up. So what you guys should be listening for there is not necessarily like the note or anything like that, but what you're listening for is that level of decay, how long this top keeps vibrating. It does seem a lot more resonant, and it's reacting to a lighter touch, which is really nice. So we're probably 80% of the way there, but what I'm going to do now is really take some time shaping these braces and getting them where I'm in that sweet spot of where they're most musical, but before they start losing their strength. And we'll just keep hogging them off, and the next time you guys hear it, it should be in its final form. The main thing that's different this time when I start hogging off wood is that I'm paying much, much closer attention. You'll see that I'm removing the bulk of the material from the side of the braces because this allows me to remove weight without reducing the strength of the wood, which is just kind of like free energy, and I like to capitalize on that as much as possible. I'll also cross-reference all of my notes from my previous builds at this point and do a bunch of really fine little sanding here and there that you're not going to see on camera before I'll call it all done. But I think the finished result on this one is awesome. All right, we're voiced at this point. It feels really, really nice. It's got just the perfect amount of flex on it. Not something I can translate in a video, but it's a feel thing and it feels right where I like it to be. But listen to this tap tone on here, and I'll do a little quick AV so you can see where we started. But listen how long this thing rings. So I'm really, really happy with that. Now that the top is all voiced, we can then put our attention back onto the sides, where we're going to begin notching them so that we can get that soundboard glued to the rim of the guitar. And we do this by using an acrylic template that shows us where all of the braces are going to go. And then we carefully notch everything out with chisels and little hand saws so that everything fits really nice and tight. And then we go back over to the go bar deck and get that top glued down. And here's the money shot, the one we've all been waiting for, that beautiful soundboard paired with the sides, and you have the most luthery of all the luthery pictures you can have. Okay, we've got the soundboard glued to the rim, and I knew the moment that I pulled it out of the go bar deck that it was going to sound really good, because even just me kind of like holding on to the rim here is making a noise. But wait till you hear this tap tone on here at this point. It's even me talking, it's picking it up. But really excited, because even when I'm it's good. At this point, we basically just need to do those same steps that we did on the soundboard, but do them on the back this time. So instead of walking you through that entire process again, I'll take this opportunity to talk about something else. And that is to say thank you to each and every one of you who watches these videos. Never in our wildest dreams did we ever think that we would hit 100,000 subscribers, and we are just about to that number. And Matt and I honestly don't have words to accurately describe the level of gratitude we have for each and every one of you for watching these videos and for subscribing to us. Our goal has always been to just try to put out entertaining videos, and our hope is that you guys are inspired and maybe you learned something along the way. But basically, yeah, I just wanted to say thanks from the bottom of our hearts. And now that I'm done with that, we can get back to this build. And what do you know? The whole body is now closed up at this point, and we can finally take it out of the mold and get the finishing touches done on it so that we can move on to the neck here sooner than later. But before we can do that, we need to remove all of the extra material that is hanging off the sides of this body. And we're going to do that with this router bit that Matt and I like to call the Widowmaker. This thing is an absolute beast. And besides trying to make sure that you don't lose a finger with it, the other thing that we really have to pay attention to is our grain direction so that we don't get a whole bunch of tear out, which would really ruin our day. But we managed to not do that here, and we have this beautiful closed up body, and it's looking really good. And the next thing we need to do is go over to the vacuum clamp, because I need to get these sides really nice and level before we can do the next step, which is going to be installing the binding for the guitar. And the reason I need everything to be as absolutely flat as possible, because the channel that I'm going to route that the binding is going to go in is going to use the sides of the guitar as a reference point to cut said channel. So if it's not flat and it has a bunch of waves in it, we're going to end up with all of those waves translated into the channel that is cut. But because we took our time to do it right the first time, we don't have to worry about that. So then we can head over to this weird looking jig that we're going to use to cut those channels. Now you can see the side of the guitar is riding on that black plastic piece, and that's why it was important that we took our time getting them nice and level. So we're going to ride this bucking bronco very carefully around the front and the back and cut channels that are going to perfectly match the binding that we're going to be installing on the guitar. And you can see how the end result came out here. And just like we bent up our sides earlier, we're going to use the side bending machine to bend up our wooden binding. And it occurs to me that I actually haven't talked about this yet in this video, but we're actually going to be using Macassar ebony to trim up the entire instrument. Macassar ebony is a little bit different than the typical ebony that you're probably familiar with, which is an African ebony, with the most highly prized pieces being basically ink black. And to me, it doesn't look a whole lot different than black plastic, so I actually really prefer this Macassar because it looks like it's actually wood. There's something interesting to look at on it. And I just feel like, you know, wood should look like wood, not plastic. So we're going to use some epoxy and some binding tape and some rubber bands and glue that in, and the end result is this nasty mess you see right here. But worry not, because we are going to use our amazing SurfPrep Light and SurfPrep Sanders to get this thing totally sanded down and looking really good. I'm using card scrapers on the side, and we'll get rid of all of that epoxy. And at this point, I think I'm going to let Past Chris show you how it all came out. Okay, we've got all of the sides leveled on here, and it's looking super good, and the body's basically done at this point, but the only thing I have left to do is put an end graft on it. And I was digging through my drawers looking for some wood, different kind of drawers. I was digging through those, and I found this end graft that I made for a client's guitar a couple of years ago, and he, for some reason, didn't like it. Well, we're going to use it on this guitar because it looks super good. I think it'll do a really nice job of tying all of the sapwood that's on this guitar into itself. So I don't have to do much here except for make a pocket for this to go in, and then we're gonna epoxy it in. And this body is totally done. And then we can move on to the neck. The process of putting the end graft in is pretty straightforward. We're going to use a Fordham tool, which is basically a high horsepower Dremel tool, to create a pocket that is the exact same depth and just about the exact same width as the end graft that we've previously made. And then we'll take some really sharp chisels and our OptiVISORs and work our way around to get nice square edges. And then that end graft should fit in there just absolutely perfectly snug. We'll take some 5-minute epoxy and we're going to put it in place, holding it down with some tape and then just putting some very, very light clamping pressure. The 5-minute epoxy makes quick work of it so that we don't have to wait very long for it to dry, and then we can move our attention around to the back of the guitar, where I like to take the end graft and wrap it around. It just creates a really beautiful visual effect. And for this overhang piece, we can just use a little bit of number 20 super glue because there's not any real pressure that's being put on it. And here's the end result. Looks really, really nice and classy. I wanted to show you guys how good this guitar sounds so far. Believe it or not, when you put the binding on, it does the very last little bit of fully sealing off the body and making it airtight, and that makes a substantial difference. I was just showing Matt, I don't know that I've ever had such a good tap tone on a guitar body at this point in the build. It's just got this second wave of sound that comes out of it, a little bit beyond when I initially hit. Like it hits, it dies, and then it blooms again. It's gonna be good. With that, I'm gonna set this aside and we will get started on the neck. Like I said earlier in this video, Matt and I really want to try to keep these videos under 30 minutes most of the time. We figure that way you guys are entertained and you're not stuck watching a movie. With that said, in order to show you guys an entire guitar build, something's gotta go. And on this particular build, we've decided that we're gonna kind of just glaze over the neck. I'm gonna do my best to make sure you guys have a sense of what goes into it, but I'm not gonna cover every little aspect of it. Our previous video that we shot in this series did cover the entire neck build, so if you're interested, feel free to go check that one out. What you're seeing on your screen now is me finishing up making the fretboard on our CNC machine out of a really beautiful piece of Magnifier ebony, the same wood that we're making all of the binding on this guitar out of. And here's how she looks hot off the press, and you'll notice how there's actually no fret markers at all on this fretboard. I want to leave it really nice and clean so that the guitar has just a very nice clean aesthetic where the wood does all the talking. At this point, we're going to use a jig and cut our mortise and tenon. Our tenon goes in the neck first, and that's what you can see here, looking real nice. Then we'll flip that jig around, attach it to the body, and then cut our mortise into it, and the two are going to fit perfectly together afterwards. Next comes the process of making sure that the neck actually fits the guitar body at the exact right angle. And we're going to do this using a technique called flossing, where I take sandpaper and remove material from the cheeks of the neck until I eventually get the exact angle that I'm looking for. I can then drill my holes for the bolts to go through and then install my barrel nuts into the tenon of the neck. At which point I can finally bolt the neck on and make sure that everything fits exactly as I need it to. I'll then take this jig here and make sure that the neck is perfectly aligned with the center of the soundboard. And then I'll take a straight edge and make sure that I have the correct amount of kickback on that neck so that once I put strings and a bridge and everything on this guitar, that my guitar plays perfect. Now we can start moving our attention towards the headstock of this guitar. And I decided at this point that I really wanted to carry over that heavy sapwood theme onto the rest of the neck. So I took some zirconia that I had from an old ukulele that I was going to build forever ago. And I decided to book match them and join them with that sapwood going down the middle to make my headstock overlay out of. And you see me making that here on the CNC machine. But let's not forget that it would not be complete if we didn't put our D in it. Nice. And just like the entire guitar, before we could call this thing done, we needed to bind our headstock overlay with some Magnifier ebony. I'm then going to repeat that entire process for the back of the headstock using some more zirconia that we're going to then join in the middle and then book match so that it looks really nice and we get that sapwood effect. The main difference between the front and the back of the headstock is that we actually need to bend the plate that's going to go on the back of the headstock so that we get this really cool looking transition effect. I was a little worried about doing this because of that glue joint going down the middle, but I was able to make it work out and it fits that neck really nicely. So at this point, what I need to do is epoxy it on. And this is going to do a couple of things. One of them, it's going to look really cool and add a really nice visual effect. The second is that it's going to add a lot of strength in that neck to headstock transition area. And now that the back is on, we can glue the front headstock overlay on, and then we just need to finish it all off with this really cool piece of zirconia on the heel cap. And I think the visual effect is going to end up being really cool once we finish carving this neck, and the sapwood theme is just going to be just chef's kiss. Now the last thing that we need to glue onto this neck before we can go about carving it is the fretboard itself. So what we need to do is put a radius on it. In this particular case, I like to use a 16-inch radius so that it feels comfortable in the hand. And then we can finally get that fretboard glued to the neck. We do want to make sure that we get the truss rod installed here, and then I just used a little bit of tape to hold everything in place while we clamp it down. And now it's finally time for us to get the frets installed on this guitar. I'm leaving out a lot of the steps that were required in prepping these frets for pressing, but I just wanted to give you guys a sense of what is involved in getting these in. So here we are smashing them in on our drill press using a fret pressing caul. And then we're going to clean up those fret ends with some nips and then put a nice bevel on the ends of them so that it's really nice and comfortable on your hand. And then we're going to follow that up with drilling some holes in the sides of the fretboard, and we will install our side dot fret markers. Now it's time to finally get about carving this neck. Now, you may have noticed that these necks come off of our CNC machine in a way that they are very, very far from being done. And that's because I'm a firm believer that necks should be carved by hand. I find that hand-carved necks tend to fit the hand in a very comfortable way, in a way that a machine-made neck does not. Now you'll see me using a whole bunch of different little hand tools here, including this pinwheel sander that I use all the time to get this neck and heel transition area. But remember, everything you're seeing in this particular clip took about a full day for me to do. It is time consuming, but it's very enjoyable, and it's really nice to see what was a squared off piece of wood turn into something so ergonomic and comfortable in the hand. And honestly, it's one of my favorite parts of a guitar build these days. And we're going to follow up all of that carving with the very last step, which is getting the headstock finished and sorted out. And that includes drilling the holes in the side for the tuning machines and then the slots for the headstock. And then we need to put these ramps in so that the strings have a place to go. And at that point, we're basically done with the entire neck. And because we're done with the entire neck, that means we're done with the entire guitar, and we can finally get this guitar prepped for the paint booth. Now, we spray nitrocellulose lacquer on our guitars, and in order to get a guitar prepped to go into the paint booth, it requires multiple days of doing what's called a pour fill, and that's what you see me doing here. We use a special kind of epoxy to fill in all of the pores so that our lacquer, when it goes on, doesn't spend all of its time shrinking back into those pores. So we spend about 4 or 5 days really taking our time applying those pour fills until we're ready to get it into the paint booth. You're not going to see me doing all of my coats of lacquer on this guitar because I don't want to spray with the door open, but just use your imagination here. I spend about a week spraying about 3 to 4 coats a day. About every 3 days I pull it out of the booth and I do a level sanding, and then we go back in and we apply more. Doing this until we get anywhere between 12 to 15 coats of lacquer. And then after that we have to let the entire guitar dry for about 2 weeks before we can do our buff out and final assembly. And that's what you see me doing here. We're doing our final assembly about 2 weeks after we got our last coat of lacquer sprayed on the instrument, using our SurfPrep sanders and this amazing Eagle abrasive sandpaper that allows us to do our entire level sand before buff out with no water. Up until this point, we've always had to use water, and this is our first guitar using this Eagle abrasive sandpaper, and it is blowing our mind. Then we're going to head over to our buffing wheel and spend a good afternoon just getting this entire guitar buffed out. I do want to take one moment to let you guys know that there has been a whole plethora of tools used in this video, and we're going to have links to all of those down below. They are affiliate links, and if you purchase anything from them, it does give us a little bit of a kickback, and we do appreciate that. It costs you nothing extra, but helps to keep the lights on for us here at Driftwood Guitars, and we appreciate it. At this point, it's just time to wrap up the last little things like gluing on the neck, installing the tuning machines, making the bridge, gluing that bridge on, doing the nut and the saddle, and then finally, we get to put strings on this guitar, and we can call it totally done. Okay, it's finally time to see what this guitar sounds like after 4 months of building it. So what we're using is a Zoom H6 digital field recorder, but instead of using the factory microphones that are built into it, we are using these beautiful condenser mics that are sitting right in front of me. And these were sent to us by the folks at microphoneparts.com. These are the SDC 84 pencil condensers, which is basically their take on the Neumann KM84 pencil mics. Much more affordable, and they are made here in the United States, and we do have a link for those down below in the description. So if you like what you hear, go check that out. But with that, let me play a little bit of music on this guitar so that you can get a sense of how it all came out. The main thing that I take away when I play this guitar at this point is how good it is with such a light touch. And that's something that you see very commonly with Western Red Cedar. It just responds to the lightest of touch with the right hand. I am not a finger picker, but for somebody that is a finger picker, this guitar would just, it would be so good. I could do my best here, show you guys a little bit of finger picking. You can get a sense of it, but it's really a feel thing. Just the lightest little bit of a touch wakes up this guitar in a way that if it were made out of spruce or something like that, it would take a lot more effort, and it's incredibly rewarding from the player's perspective. Yeah, man, and when I'm flat picking, it just responds so nice. Western Red Cedar tends to be a little bit more rounded and woody sounding than a lot of spruces. It doesn't quite have as much sparkle as spruces have, but the zirconia back and sides that we have on this guitar are what I usually describe as a very glassy sounding wood, and I think that that brings in a lot of that treble that we would have lost by not using spruce for our top. It may not have quite as much bottom end on that low E string than we would with a different top wood choice, but it definitely makes up for it in that low mid range all the way up to the upper mid range. And this guitar particularly, I think, would be a real joy to use in the recording studio because you're not trying to dial out all that bottom end. I'm just really in love with this guitar. It has just such a nice flavor to it. It's just so nice. Well, I think that gives you guys a real basic idea of how this guitar sounds. We do need to get it packed up, put in its case, and Matt's actually going to be driving it up to St. Louis here in the next few days, where it will be going to Eddie's Guitars. We're going to have a link to their website down below, and those guys are going to be putting out a more comprehensive video about how this guitar sounds. People are going to be playing it that are way more accomplished than I am and giving you a much more true taste of what this guitar is capable of. So we will have a link to them down below. Make sure you guys go check out their website and their YouTube channel as well. And we'll see you guys in the next one. Thanks a lot.